a fraction this a deal.
So, Athens was a pretty big success. Despite the limited international representation, the Games proved profitable and politically successful. So politically successful, in fact, that King George of Greece basically declared that Greece would be hosting every Olympics following this. Coubertin was pissed about this, and the bickering about 1900 and where it would be hosted would begin before the final medals were even awarded in 1896. On top of being largely muscled out of the small-scale planning of the Games by the Greek organizers, Coubertin felt like King George was attempting an Olympic coup. He asserted, probably accurately, that holding the Olympics in Athens forever would prove difficult because Greece was still pretty poor, didn't have the infrastructure for a truly international contest, and would probably dissuade athletes from far away from taking part. It would become yet another Greek national festival, and Coubertin and his largely French IOC buddies would be forced out. At the 1894 conference, Pierre and the fledgling IOC had already decided to award the 1900 Games to Paris, his hometown, and the 1904 Games to a yet undecided American city. Pierre semi-sneakily scheduled the first official IOC meeting really quickly after the 1896 Games took place, back on his home turf in Le Havre, where the group decided once and for all to tell King George basically to fuck himself, in a very diplomatic and aristocratic way, of course, and start planning the Games for Paris in 1900. Coubertin offered the king a compromise, though. The Olympics would be held at cities around the world every 4 years, but he suggested an Athenaea, a separate and smaller-scale international sports contest to be continuously held in Athens beginning in 1898. The king was not into this compromise at all, suggesting the less compromisey compromise of just holding the Olympics every 2 years and having even-numbered editions held in Athens. Coubertin said no, and they were at a stalemate. In 1900, Paris was in the midst of Exposition fever, and after the rousing success of the 1889 Paris Exposition, starring brand new Eiffel Tower, hated by most at first, another exposition was scheduled for 1900. Pierre suggested including the Olympics as one of the many great attractions of the 1900 Universal Exposition. The opening ceremonies and certain events would take place in Archery Olympia, remade to scale out of plaster and paint in the middle of Paris. This immediately ran into a speed bump when Picard, the grumpy old guy running the exposition who happened to hate sports, vetoed the whole idea. Eventually, after Pierre de Coubertin got enough fancy French guys on his side, he pressured Picard to allow it. Picard then basically said, if you're going to do sports, just do all the sports stuff we were already going to do for our thing, and then fold that into your whole Olympics thing. He then assigned each sport to some bureaucratic subcommittee almost at random. For example, the International Fencing Organizing Body was literally paired up with the Universal Exposition's Cutlery Squad. Thus, the various Olympic events were decentralized around congested central Paris. Thankfully, the Paris Metro came to the rescue, surprisingly finishing on time and on budget after 2 years of construction, coinciding with the Universal Exposition. Consisting of part of what is now Line 1, the original service ran only from the Porte de Maillot to the Porte de Vincennes, servicing areas near the Seine, but still not aiding transportation to sites farther afield. The fact Pierre and company were now in charge of everything possibly connected with sports at the Exposition accounts for why there are certain strange sports included, either officially or unofficially. The distinction between what was official Olympics business and what wasn't is also very blurry. Some events are indisputably Olympic, and some are clearly too bananas to even consider. There are many which are a bit of both, and even the most unambiguously Olympic events weren't labeled the Olympics at all, but rather given the much less catchy title, the International Physical Exercise and Sports Concourse, which sounds less like the Olympics and more like floor 3 of a Courtyard Marriott. By 1900, Pierre was basically nowhere to be found, instead giving up organizing to a group of IOC buddies and people already planning the exposition. One of the unintentional benefits of this disarray was the almost accidental inclusion of women's events in the contest. Because each sport was kind of making things up on the fly, occasionally women were given the opportunity to compete, even though Pierre and his buddies at the IOC might have tried to stop them. The World's Fair, on the other hand, seemed to go pretty well. A huge success with the public and a modest financial one. There were like 90,000 exhibits in a huge fair that lasted for 6 months, meaning the Olympics also lasted 6 months. These old World's Fairs are a mixed bag for me. For every piece of amazing architecture or crazy future technology, you get some horrible colonialist human zoo or something. This World's Fair had a bit of that, but surprisingly the exhibit called The Exhibit of American Negroes was actually not racist, and instead a celebration of civil rights put on by W.E.B. Du Bois. That is not what I would have expected. So, for Paris 1900, weightlifting and wrestling were dropped because the IOC ran out of leotards and mustache oil, but a bunch of sports were added. Some of these new sports were sensible and lasted: archery, soccer, tennis, rugby. Other new sports were stupid and for rich people, but stayed because rich people decide these sorts of things, like equestrian, fencing, golf, polo, rowing, and sailing. There's some outlier sports that are weirdly absent today, like cricket. Then you get the really strange ones. The 1900 Olympics held events in Basque Pelota, Croquet, and Tug of War. Until last year, we could have also counted events in auto racing, motorcycle racing, competitive fishing, competitive cannon shooting, firefighting, life-saving, pigeon racing, speedboat races, underwater swimming obstacle race, whatever that is, and hot air balloon. All of these events were held, but last year were declared too silly to be included in the official record book. Champion balloonist Comte Henri de Laval will surely be furious.
De l'opéra, record Edison.
Archery. All of the archery events are very weird and have French names. One source I found bluntly stated, quote, "The archery events at the 1900 Paris Exposition are very confusing. France and Belgium were the only entrants and therefore obviously did very well. This archery contest had very little in common with how archery is contested at the Olympics now. So it's kind of an oddity in that way. Alright, let's move on to the athletics. So America again dominates the athletics like they did 4 years ago in Athens, especially with star athletes Alvin the Jumping German Kreinslein and Walter the Dentist Tewksbury, those are their real nicknames, cleaning up in both the runny and jumpy events. Kreinslein wins a still unmatched number of medals in the track events. Even though one of their best athletes, Meyer Prinstein, was Jewish, the Americans refused to compete on Sunday and demanded rescheduling. Apparently, Meyer Prinstein was annoyed by this, and Alvin Kreinslein was annoyed back, and they had a mini religious war over this, leading to Prinstein punching Kreinslein in the face. It was basically a stupid scheduling conflict, and both of them ended up having to compete on their Sabbaths anyway, meaning it was all very stupid. Luxembourgishman Michel Theato won the marathon, but is still credited as a Frenchman because it's unclear if he had French citizenship or not, but he did compete for the French team. This is notable to point out because Luxembourg is like weirdly very good at track events for being such a tiny nation. Like Luxembourg at the time had a population of like maybe 150,000 people, and it would, you know, stay relatively close to that. But they've had some pretty impressive track stars and athletics Olympians over the years. Theato won this marathon, and then later Josie Bartel would do really well in Helsinki in 1952. They have a lot of medals for a country with a population of like 6 people. The marathon was, again, incredibly poorly organized. Without a real fixed course, they just sort of set up a departure point and then an end point around 25-ish miles away, so not a standard length for a marathon, and then basically just told them, you know, yeah, figure it out. And unfortunately, the busy city center of Paris was like in the middle of this, so they were basically like, yeah, just go run through Paris, like figure it out. And allegedly, Michel Theato and Émile Champion, who both had lived in Paris for many years, were accused of using their knowledge of Parisian alleyways to cheat by like taking shortcuts. The marathon is also notable for its last place contender, Ronald McDonald. Crane's Line shares the jumping gold with fellow Americans Meyer Prinstein and Ray Urey. The hammer throw even seems kind of fixed, considering only the USA and Sweden entered. The United States knew and practiced this event. Sweden had never even heard of it. The USA obviously sweeps the podium, and the Swedes all finish way, way behind. The hammer throw almost results in the audience getting hammers thrown at them as well by inexperienced Swedish throwers. In the 100-meter dash, preeminent sprinter Duffy, who had set a record in the 100-yard dash that would stand for 37 years, makes an early lead before pulling a muscle and falling behind, letting Jarvis take gold. That's Frank Jarvis. The steeplechase event, basically a mix of hurdles and an obstacle course at around 2,500 meters, was handily won by George Orton, who used a strategy of pacing himself as to not overexert. In the 4,000-meter race, he was again dead last, but everybody thought he was just busting out his genius pacing maneuver, but instead he just had food poisoning and quit to go have diarrhea. Overall, these events are a mess. They're not held in a stadium, but rather in a big open field in the Bois de Boulogne, with uneven terrain and small copses of trees scattered around. Other standouts were Asia's first medalist, who, because it was 1900, was of course a white guy named Norman Pritchard, who would compete for British India. He would later be an actor in such films as The Love Trap and The Black Panthers Club. So, Basque Pelota. This is one of the weird sports that's still technically official, but this event was just complete bullshit. Basque Pelota is a sport that's not only common in Spain, it's really only common in one small part of Spain, the Basque Country. I guess if you count the related sport of jai-alai, it's common in Spain and amongst Cuban grandpas in Miami, but unless the United States is going to field a national team of Cuban-American grandpas, it's really not a fair competition. In the end, only 2 athletes entered the tournament, a doubles team from Spain. Originally, another 2 from France's Basque Country were going to compete, but they withdrew for some unknown reason. So Spain had literally nobody to play against, and immediately won the tournament by default, and the gold medal. The silver and bronze medal went to no one. The cricket tournament was almost as lopsided as the Basque Pelota tournament. It had 2 teams though, instead of 1, and 24 athletes across the 2, which is a healthier amount of competition. But the 2 teams were basically just British guys. Both were local cricket clubs, one from England and one from France, but both fielded mostly English players. So even the French cricket team was just English guys, and the English team won. The English team, not the French English team. Let's go on to the croquet. One of the events was called Singles One Ball, which sounds like a great band name, or the instructions for a weird party. All the guys playing this have great hats and shoes, and look like they're having a jolly great time. The results for these events are mostly lost to time, and France was the only participant and therefore medalist. Cycling. That insane 12-hour race was retired, thankfully, replaced with the more sensible 2,000-meter and 25-kilometer events. The French did very well, otherwise it was an unremarkable series of events, besides the fact that one French competitor was named Vladislav Chalupa. The equestrian events look crazy. I don't know anything about equestrian sports. This isn't horse racing, mind you, but rather horse obstacle coursing and horse jumping. These horse style names are great though. Dressage and puissance. puissance sounds like the French word for pussy, but apparently it's not. These events are stupid and dull. At least the medalists had interesting names. Extra Dry took the gold in the puissance contest. The weirdest event was Mail Coach, which involved riders driving a 4-horse mail truck and being graded in stylishness by a panel of experts. I wish the current Olympics had an event where postal employees competed in stylishly driving their mail trucks. The fencing contest was one of the few early Olympic events to completely allow professionals, albeit in a different tournament. Razor Ramon Fonst of Cuba, not his real name unfortunately, was the clear standout player. Georges de Falaise was the clear standout mustache. The soccer tournament, rather typically for these early Olympics, featured club teams rather than national teams. English team Upton Park, which don't exist anymore, represented Great Britain. Club Francais represented France, and also don't exist anymore. Third place went to the University of Brussels team, an international squad with a Dutch and British player. The men's competition in golf consisted of 36 holes of stroke play. Hey golf fans, isn't that like a lot? Isn't a round of golf typically 18 holes, right? Women had a tournament too, but they only got 9 holes. There's gotta be some sort of 1950s bar joke about women having a quarter as many holes as men. I'll get back to you on that one later. The lady golf outfits are also hilariously impractical. One of the competitors later founded Listerine, and the airport in St. Louis is named after him. Fun fact. Gymnastics. France swept the individual gymnastics tournament. Bars were rotated around, beams were balanced upon, etc. These events also included Africa's debut at the Olympics. France fielded a team of 4 gymnasts from Iran and French Algeria, none of whom medaled. Polo appeared for the first and only time at the Olympics. Like the soccer tournament, club teams competed instead of national ones, resulting in teams of mixed nationality winning every medal. Fox Hunters Hurlingham won gold, and then folded in 1925. They're the only polo team that competed at the 1900 contest that has a Wikipedia page. Rowing events were held in the Seine, of course. The Dutch team of Francois Brandt and Roelof Klein are pictured here creepily holding a boy. That boy was in fact one of the many unknown children who acted as coxswains, not a sexual thing, I promise, and that boy is therefore the only Olympic medalist whose identity is completely unknown. Rugby. Again, the rugby tournament was a club tournament, not a national one. The favorite, the Moseley Wanderers, arrived late and sick on a boat voyage from England, winning only bronze. Silver went to a German team, SC 1880 Frankfurt, which still exists. France picked up gold. Sailing. This is always a weird thing to include in the Olympics, sailing. Maybe I'm wrong about this, it just feels kind of not right for whatever reason. Maybe because it's so reliant on vehicles. I guess you could argue horse racing is kind of a similar deal. I would also not be surprised if that got dropped from the program at some point. I guess the smaller versions of this of sailing are windsurfing, which does seem like more of a sport in my mind. For whatever reason, but like full big boat sailing, I guess ship sailing, this doesn't feel like a sport to me. The wind is doing most of the work, right? Although, on the boat races at Paris 1900, it wasn't, because every race was plagued by a complete lack of wind. These big boat races involve some pretty big boats, too. There's a race for 20-plus ton yachts. A 20-ton yacht could comfortably house Sonny Crockett and his pet alligator Elvis. That's not for racing. The shooting events look fairly similar to what we see today, actually. Switzerland dominated shooting. Swiss people love guns. They love guns so much they built a shooting range on top of a highway. Aside from the official shooting events that look pretty normal, some wild shooting events were also contested and later declared un-Olympic, including a skeet shooting event with real live pigeons. So clearly being a pigeon spectator at these Olympics was preferable to a pigeon athlete. In the Seine, John Jarvis of Great Britain was the standout here, with his Australian crawl. The swimming events established Great Britain and Australia as dominant swimming powers, which is true until today, and also included some weird swimming events like an underwater race and an obstacle course. Tennis. Again, women got to do tennis, but had to wear this impractical outfit. Britain won every gold medal. Tug of War. That this is still considered an official event is very funny to me. The Scandinavians entered late, but defeated their only other competition, the Racing Club of France, a French team which happened to have one Colombian competitor, strangely enough, making him, I'm fairly certain, the first South American Olympian. Sorry, Luis, from last time, but I do not believe you were real. That's all of the Olympic sports, but it gets weirder. The following are the sports declared un-Olympic by the IOC session a couple of years ago. So let's move on to competitive fishing. Competitive fishing, or angling as it was called, was held with winners in both total quantity of fish and aggregate weight. Unfortunately, they fished in the Seine, which during the turn of the century, I'm sure, was filled with coal bilge pollution, dead child laborers, and opium, so the fish was probably very gross. Hot air balloon. Henri de Laval won this single gargantuan event, a hot air balloon race that spanned all of Europe. Competitors were graded on both speed and maximum distance crossed. Laval blew the rest out of the water, making it all the way to Zhytomyr, near Kiev. Most of the other competitors only made it to Germany. Boules. I don't know what this is. Apparently it's kind of like lawn bowling or like bocce ball. The results for this weren't recorded, so I have no idea what happened, but it's very funny to me that bocce ball was at one time an Olympic sport. Competitive cannon shooting. This is especially weird. Can one fire a cannon exceptionally well? Isn't it mostly a correct/incorrect binary? Again, the results are not recorded, so I can't explain much about this. Competitive firefighting. So volunteer and professional firemen each had a separate tournament. Apparently by this very scientific Olympic method in 1900, the 5 best places to have your house catch on fire were Budapest, Leighton, England, Porto, Portugal, Milan, and Kansas City.
Because I hurt so bad inside, not being able to do more with what I had. The horror struck me as I seen people laying there, smashed underneath us tons of steel, and knowing that we probably would not be able to lift it with what equipment that we had.
Weirdly, the manufacturers of the cars won instead of the drivers. I have very little information as to what the course was, like where they were driving, but there were tons of events for all sorts of weird vehicles. There were races for coupes, sedans, minivans, taxis, electric taxis, delivery vans, and fire trucks. Recognizable car companies like Renault and Peugeot won medals, and some other French car companies I don't recognize because they probably don't exist anymore. The 1900 Olympics is a supremely weird sporting event, and it's perhaps the most alien of all of the Olympics to the modern mind. Like, I can't imagine the Olympics in any way going like this. But you have to keep in mind that even though the 1896 Olympics were a pretty big deal, and, you know, they were successful, they were still seen as sort of this, like, regional oddity. And the Olympics just did not have the international clout that they have today, or even that they had in, like, you know, 20 or 30 years later. In 1900, the Olympics was still, like, you know, seen as kind of stupid by a lot of people, to be honest, and that's why it was relegated to like a side attraction within a World's Fair. The World's Fairs had been going on for 50 years at this point, and those were the real draw. Those were a tried and tested formula, you know, for building a big mass event, but the Olympics weren't. And that resulted in the 1900 Olympics just being completely overshadowed, not just in historical record by the Paris Exposition, but even contemporaneously. As I mentioned earlier, the Paris Universal Exposition lasted for 6 months, and that was not a complete 6-month period of Olympic sports. That would be crazy. The Olympic sports were basically held intermittently throughout this 6-month period. You know, there'd be one here, one there, but there would be gaps of weeks and months in between them. And so it wasn't really this cohesive idea. It wasn't this 2-week period of sports, of international sports contest, that we're familiar with now. It was very unusual. The other thing that's important to note is that the Olympics were so unimportant in 1900 that a lot of the people competing at the Olympics didn't even know that they were competing at the Olympics. And the people in the audience, the very few people in the audience who attended some of these events, were also unaware that they were watching the Olympics, that they were watching an event that would be held in the same esteem as, you know, in the same record books as Olympic highlights like the Miracle on Ice, or like, you know, Usain Bolt running under 10 seconds for the 100-meter or whatever. But they were. A good example of this is the croquet, which the croquet is so... It's so weird that they even held croquet in the first place at the Olympics. But to me, it's a perfect case study of everything bizarre about the 1900 Olympics. So nobody in the croquet tournament knew that they were competing in the Olympics. A number of the croquet athletes were not only not professionals, that's to be expected from the Olympics at this point, but not even like croquet masters. These were just like random people that they pulled off the street in France. Random rich people that happened to like to play croquet. I've played croquet once or twice before. I would have been declared, you know, competent enough to be in the Olympics, which is crazy. The other thing that's important to note is that the croquet events were so unimportant that there was literally 2 spectators for the entire croquet tournament, which, you know, was probably partly because the Olympics were very poorly promoted. They were a subheading under a subheading under a program for the Universal Exposition, but also because, like, this is, you know, croquet is not the sport of the masses. It's not now, and it wasn't even back in 1900. The Olympics was still very kind of in the highfalutin world of weird, fancy gentleman sports. Really, the only sports in here that are, like, not like that, to be honest, are, like, soccer and rugby, which were the most popular sports, obviously, amongst the spectators. But yeah, so these 1900 Olympics are bizarre. And you might think, like, oh, these are the peak of terribleness for the Olympics. How much worse can it get? But you better hold on till 1904, in 4 years, when the Olympics are set to be held in Chicago, and they are bound to be even worse. So stay tuned, everybody.